So yeah, you came to do a job talk at Harvard for an assistant professorship position, and I'd been aware of your work on disgust then, and agitated hard for them to hire you because I thought it was of great significance, which turned out to be exactly the case. So what do you remember about that?
I remember I was so excited to have an interview at Harvard. It was my only interview. If I didn't get that job, I had no job for the following year. And it was a very strange day in which I didn't feel particularly welcome or wanted. And then I had my session with you, in which here was this guy who he actually got a job at Harvard, and he was studying Jung, which is like almost taboo, and he was talking about dreams and creativity. And so that was the bright memory of the day, was our hour-long conversation.
Yeah, well, I was also really interested at the time and now in the biological basis of behavior, right? And so, and in the relationship between fundamental motivational systems and thought, because obviously our thought is grounded in fundamental motivational systems, and your work on disgust, which maybe you can tell the viewers a little bit about, was really interesting to me because it was an emotional system that hadn't been studied much. I mean, you were really one of the pioneers in the psychological study of disgust.
Well, the way to explain it is that Paul Rosen, my advisor at Penn, is the pioneer in the study of disgust, and he'd studied it as a food-related emotion, and he'd written a bit about it being a moral emotion. And I was a graduate student at Penn, and I was interested in morality, and I was reading the Bible, and I was reading anthropological accounts of different countries and different cultures. And at the time, morality was all about reasoning about harm, rights, and justice. So Lawrence Kohlberg was the leading figure in the field. And because I was looking at morality across cultures, and when you look across cultures, it's not just about fairness and harm and rights, it's about menstruation and food taboos and skin lesions, and it's very physical. And I was, why do so many societies, why is it like the normal default way of being is to somehow bring the body into morality? Why is that? And so I just happened to be at Penn, where the world's expert in disgust was, and I went to talk to him, and that started one of the best collaborations of my life. And what it led to is a broadening of the moral domain, basically. There's a sort of a Western secular approach that you see in Western philosophers. Either morality is about harm and utilitarianism, and let's minimize harm, or it's about rights and principles, Immanuel Kant. And a much better way psychologically to think about morality is virtue ethics. It's just a lot of stuff. We have just a lot of stuff that we judge on. And this led me eventually to realize that people on the left and people on the right care about different stuff. Everybody cares about harm and fairness. But the stuff about keeping boundaries around the group, build a wall, protect the group, hold the group together, hate traitors, everybody can do that, but right-wing morality builds on these additional foundations of these additional emotions and foundations. So that work on disgust that I was just beginning to talk about then when we first met in 1994 led eventually to what we now call moral foundations theory, and with about 5 or 6 colleagues. If you go to yourmorals.org, you can take our test, you can learn all about it. But it led to the perspective that ultimately was, I think, the right perspective as the cultural war was heating up and as left and right were essentially becoming like different countries, different cultures.
So it's not obvious on first consideration why disgust would be a moral emotion. So, most of the work that's done that's outside of the disgust realm, I would say, is predicated on the assumption that the reason that conservatives in particular, but perhaps people who are more authoritarian in general, draw boundaries around their territories because they're afraid of the other. But that isn't really how it plays out, as far as I can tell, because conservatives, for example, are less neurotic than in the big 5 trait sense than liberals, although it's a minor difference. But the disgust issue seems to be particularly relevant. So can you tell us a little bit about why disgust per se?
Well, first, conservatives are a little less neurotic, but they also, if you do very low-level perceptual experiment, just like a puff of white noise in the ear, people who react more strongly to any sort of very low-level threat, are more likely to vote Republican in this country. So there are all these interesting personality differences that lead to different politics. But as for why disgust, so I'm a Durkheimian, I would say. I love the sociologist Emil Durkheim. And I'm a social psychologist, so I'm always thinking not about people as individual utility maximizers, but people as members of social groups, people who are totally focused on belonging in their social groups, and people who have some pro-social motives about keeping the group together, about doing things that are good for the group. So as I try to argue in my book, The Righteous Mind, yes, we're selfish. There's no doubt that we often will do things to advance our own self-interest at the expense of others. But we're also really groupish, which means we'll do all sorts of things to advance our group at the expense of others. Basically, we're tribal. We evolved as a tribal species, and we have all this software, I would say, all these predispositions, these mental predispositions for life in tribes that are battling other tribes. And that's why it comes out so easily. If you look at the way boys organize themselves when they get a fraternity, the hazing rituals. When you look at the way, it's especially clear in boys, the way street gangs organize themselves. Girls' tribalism is a little different. But I would say this is, and that's why, again, I love the Jungian approach of archetypes. There's just this weird stuff that is pan-human. Even if it comes out slightly differently around the world, there really is a human nature, and it comes complete with a whole bunch of pre-designed ideas.
So there was a new article, I think it was published in Nature, I'll try to find the link for it, it's about a year old, that was based on high-resolution imaging of neuronal connections. It's actually reviewed in Kurzweil's book, How to Build a Mind, I think that's the name of it. And so it turns out that the cortex is made out of these columnar structures that are pre-organized units of neurons, and they're replicated across the entire cortex. It's basically the same structure. And like the older, let's say, connectionist idea was that neurons that fire together wire together, right? That's Hebb, and of course that's pretty standard neurology, but the columns are already pre-wired, so it's actually columns that fire together, that wire together, but there's even more with the high-resolution scanning. So it turns out that underneath the columnar structure, there are these pre-built highways that are connective tissue that are pre-prepared, so the columns have the option to connect to the underlying highway, and then that highway can connect to other columns. So it's as if implicit in the brain organization, and this is at the cortical level, say nothing of subcortical organization, there's already pre-existent likelihoods that certain neurons will wire together. Yeah, so and what else is cool is that this is actually architecturally quite regular. So they found that these superhighways are arranged in lines and at right angles to one another. So it's almost like a three-dimensional structure of wired cubes that underlies the neuronal structure. So that's some neurological evidence for the archetypal idea.
So let me just explain to the viewers here why this isn't just some psychological geek conversation. This is actually really relevant to a lot of the things that we'll be talking about and that your audience probably cares about, because one of the most contested ideas in the social sciences is the idea of innateness. And the idea is, well, if something is innate, then it can't vary across societies. And if it varies across societies, then it's not innate. And if gender varies, if masculinity or femininity vary across societies, then it's not innate, it's socially constructed. But that's the wrong understanding of innateness. The definition that I use comes from Gary Marcus, who's actually a neuroscientist here at NYU. He says, innate doesn't mean hardwired. There's almost nothing interesting that's hardwired. Innate means structured in advance of experience, but then experience can still revise it. And boy, does that work for gender, for almost everything.
For fears.
Yeah, that's right, almost everything. We're not a blank slate about anything. And something I used to tell my students at UVA, I taught at UVA for 16 years, is, everything's a social construction. Masculinity, femininity, cancer, the sun, death, everything there's a social construction for. You won't find a society that doesn't have thoughts about these things. But the fact that societies have social constructions tells us nothing about whether there's not also an underlying biological reality. And in almost all cases, there is.
Well, otherwise we wouldn't be able to communicate, which is one of E.O. Wilson's comments, right? Wilson is the entomologist who studied ants at Harvard and also wrote a number of books about sociobiology that got him in trouble with the radical leftists. And he said, even if we could communicate with ants, there'd be nothing to say to each other because their fundamental mode of being in the world is based on motivations and interests that are so different from ours that there wouldn't be any structure for communication. And you can kind of tell that with regards to the animals that we make friends with, right? We're much more likely to make friends with animals who have a fundamental biological and social nature that's very close to ours, like dogs, because we can basically speak their language, even though not completely.
A mammal language of love, and I miss you and I want to play with you. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, exactly, and that bonding.
Yeah. Okay, so back to disgust. So the fundamental thing that I learned from Paul Rozin is to see us as these amazing omnivores. This is part of our survival strategy, even more than other apes. We are just brilliant omnivores. And we have the omnivore's dilemma, which is we've got to be interested in all kinds of new stuff. We're not tied to any place. We can roam onto a whole new continent. So we're interested in stuff. But stuff has all kinds of toxins and microbes. So we have to be careful about that stuff. And so these motives have to be in tension. And this is actually an interesting way to understand the left-right difference. You have to have both motives. But so imagine two siblings, one of whom is set more towards trying new stuff, seeking out new stuff. And the other is a little more fearful, a little more like, whoa, no, let's not try that. Let's stay with what's tried and true. I mean, that's progressivism and conservatism. That's the origins of it. And if you look at kids' behavior at the age of 2 or 3, it does predict how they'll vote much later. Not hugely, but there is a clear prediction there. So disgust is part of a regulatory system about our engagement with the world. And whether we are just sort of out there and we seek out variety and diversity, we think diversity is just a great thing, or whether we want a little more order, structure, predictability. Conservatives are neater than progressives. If you take photos of their rooms, you can actually, the cleanliness and organization, you can predict how they vote. Disgust, it turns out, what's really cool about disgust in modern politics is if you look at all the different things that we're fighting over, especially in this country, our culture wars over, going back a few decades, sex, drugs, the flag, immigration, all of these things. I have a study with my colleagues, it was led by Sena Koleva, in which we asked all these cultural war attitudes of people, and we also had their scores on the disgust scale, but one of the foundations of morality is sanctity and purity, and it relates to disgust. What we found is that if you know what people's left-right, how they place themselves on the left-right scale, you can pretty much predict where they fall on most culture war attitudes, except for those that load on or implicate sanctity or purity. So what I mean is flag burning. Okay, do you think that people should have the right to burn the American flag or the country's flag as an expression, as a political action? What do you think? People give some answer on a 1 to 7 scale. And people on the right think, more likely to say no. People on the left, yes. People who score high on loyalty are more likely to say no. People who lower on it say yes. And that's even taking account of where they are on the left-right dimension. But here's the cool thing. It's only if you add in the purity or sanctity thing that you can really understand what people are doing. Because some people see the flag not as just a piece of cloth. They see it as having some innate essence, something sacred about it, which must be protected. And so this is true.
They think of it as a unifying center.
Exactly. That's right. So if there's something sacred, and this is the central piece of my work around politics and morality, is the psychology of sanctity. If you hold something sacred, then your team circles around it, and it's only those who circle around with you, and sometimes literally circle around, like Muslims at prayer in Mecca, they literally circle the Kaaba. Circling is a very primitive, ancient, it feels right to circle something. But even if you do it symbolically, or you all bow at the same time, that binds you together.
Children do that with their mothers when they engage in exploratory behavior, right? Well, they use their mother as a center of the world, and children differ in the degree to which they'll move outward from their mother. So they move out until they trip over their uncertainty threshold.
Oh, neat. And is it a distance? Like
it's
you
a
can measure the
distance,
distance?
yeah. And so the more exploratory kids who are lower in negative emotion will go out farther before they come back to their mother. So the mother's a center. And that would be associated symbolically with the idea of the center as a motherland or potentially as a fatherland.
Right, that's right, that makes sense. So this way that we are incredibly symbolic creatures. We're not just out to make as much money as we can. We're symbolic and social creatures. And this psychology of sanctity or purity has become really important, not just on the right. It's always been important for especially religious conservatives. We're beginning to see it even on the campus left. And this is why I think we see some of the odd things we see on campus, that the campus must be kept as a sacred and pure space. One of the things that really alarms me about what's happened on campus in the last couple of years is that the older idea we had that it's a place for contesting ideas, it's a zone of enormous choice, people can take what courses they want, say what they want, it's kind of a wonderful free-for-all with norms of respect. It's now becoming much more of a religious zone where the perimeter of the campus is the boundaries, and within they're blasphemy laws basically. And I really started noticing this when you look at the videos of the Middlebury protest when Charles Murray spoke at Middlebury. And as everybody knows, he was shouted down. So the students are chanting, and they're chanting in unison, and it seems like a religious revival meeting. And they're swaying, and they're saying their sacred, racist, sexist, anti-gay, Charles Murray, go away. It's like a ritual incantation. So that
to define the space as safe, and it's safe in a kind of a maternal way.
Not yet. So far, all that's happening is they're binding together, they're moving, and synchronous movement and call and response. So it's using a lot of tropes from religion and religious worship. But here's the cool thing: when the administrator, I forget who it is, comes on to say, "Okay, we're moving the talk," and then you hear a couple people screaming out, "Off campus, off campus," and he says, "To another location on campus." And there's like, oh, no. Because, look, no one had to go to this talk. So everyone could have just stayed home. Mm-hmm. And the students did succeed in shutting down the venue, so they could have declared victory. But it's not a full victory unless he is physically off the campus. We can't have him speaking on campus because that defiles us, that pollutes us. We must shut that down. And that's where I started saying, wow, this is like full-blown psychology of religion, Durkheim, sanctity, purity, blasphemy. And that, I think, that doesn't describe most students, but that describes as sort of the core, those who really have their identities wrapped up in this movement.